then we respond and recover. Now, traditionally, we really left the citizens' involvement to the preparedness phase. Okay, this was like public health's job. The LHDs themselves, mitigation had a lot to do. At least a lot of it classically has to do with engineering. Making our structures stronger. Preparedness was a thing we told citizens they could do. Get a kit, get a plan, being 90% around that. In hurricane land, that was also knowing how to board up your windows and how to evacuate. But once the earthquake or hurricane occurred, we kind of expected that citizens would get out of the way and let the responders do the responding and let the recovery people do the recovering. Would be commanded and controlled by those. Well, resilience takes us in a very different direction. So I'm going to throw out a verbose definition because it actually is useful to get at the very heart of its multifacets. Okay, this is from the U.S. National Health Security Strategy, and it points out that resilience is the whole cycle. Okay, that's all parts of it. That is preventing, withstanding, and mitigating the stress of an incident. And by the way, you can talk about incident, or for this conversation, we can talk about a condition. It's recovering in a way that restores the community to self-sufficiency and at least the same level of health and social functioning. We, of course, today talked about bouncing forward. So it has in there at least, because it's a federal government document, but we, of course, don't believe that. It's really about bouncing forward. But the fact that it's even at least the same level is actually throwing us a little bit of a bone in that direction. And using knowledge from the response to strengthen the community's ability. So that's a lot about identifying through outcome evaluation or just through storytelling what were the things that allowed us to do well. What were our strengths? What were our resources? What can we learn from that? And how can we bring that back in? So we know that communities are resilient after disasters. There is no such thing as a community that's resilient or not. There's levels of resilience in communities all the time. Here's a picture from Tohoku, Japan. This building had fallen. People had been rescued out of it. Research showed that of the people who have been rescued out of fallen structures in the Tohoku earthquake, between 60 and 90% were rescued by neighbors, not by first responders. This makes sense. The definition of a disaster is that needs way outstrip the resources. You're going to be saved by your neighbors. Here's, of course, a map of New York City and New Jersey after Hurricane Sandy, or Superstorm Sandy. And I think we saw resilience come up after Hurricane Sandy. So this is a picture from Airbnb. Airbnb had just launched around 2012. Really had gotten big in the cities at that point. And users hacked it, so to speak, to give away their apartments to internally displaced, to people who had to be evacuated from their homes. So they would give away their apartment and put people up, and they could only put they had to put some dollar amount in there. So that's why it says $10. But they would do that and give away their apartments and put people up. Of course, then Airbnb heard about this and turned this into an Airbnb/disaster site that they now stand up after disasters in every community. And for instance, after the Woolsey fire, which was the fire up in Malibu in November, we put our home up on the Airbnb website. So this resource was used by communities to activate that resilience. Doctors gave away free medical care. This is a picture of a restaurant giving away free tacos. This is a very resourceful Columbia student who has set up a bicycle generating station, and he's got a table with a power strip, and people are plugging in their telephones because having communication to tell your family that you're okay or to check on other ones is a primary need that people feel they need after a disaster. So we have this person who has this ordinary ability, really for him, ordinary ability to develop a bicycle charging station that he turns out in a community at this extraordinary occurrence. And so we say it's these ordinary abilities in extraordinary circumstances, as an example of the kinds of assets and resources we already have and strengths we already have in our community. Occupy Sandy had been quiescent. You may remember Occupy Sandy from the housing, from the 2008 recession. It had been quiescent for a couple of years after it got its work done. The leaders of Occupy Sandy resurrected themselves the leaders of Occupy Wall Street resurrected themselves as Occupy Sandy for recovery and response and recovery of Hurricane Sandy. So they became, they took over a church. They used that as a reception center for bringing in needed goods, for cleanup material, as well as for bringing in volunteers and organizing them, and then sending them out to Staten Island and Coney Island and the beach areas of Brooklyn. They also used their connections to the mayor's office and to councilmen to get things done, to get communities cleaned up faster. They had these phone numbers, they had the Rolodex, they had their networks, and they tapped into that, and that became a source of resilience for the communities. This is an example on the right from Haiti. After the Haitian earthquake, this community had these clogged streets, debris everywhere, and they could not rebuild if they couldn't pull the debris out of the road. If you can't pull the debris out of the road, you can't get your construction crews up to rebuild. Well, the librarian in the town had some connections to the jurisdictional offices in the government and was able to pull some strings, or make the phone calls rather, to get the debris removed. So this is an example for me because who would have thought that a librarian necessarily would be your resource in a disaster? So one more example. After Hurricane Sandy, we did research on organizations that had been active in disasters in the New York City region. And we saw that just like the connections that individuals have with each other, in other words, the social networks that we all have, make a real difference in recovery, like the stories I just told you, that the organizational networks that occur also really influence recovery. So this is a map of organizational relationships to each other. The colors signify the sector that the organizations belong to. Not surprisingly, this was a question about their involvement in recovery activities, and the organizations that were the most active, had the most relationships, came from emergency management, public health, and social services, and community and faith-based sectors. Some people find that surprising that the community and faith-based sectors were so engaged. Organizations that had no prior mission in emergency management, but because they were so connected to their community, immediately rejiggered and remissioned to be about community recovery. And in this one slide, we also found out that the organizations that reported the most amount of connections to other organizations reported the most amount of success in their recovery efforts. So organizations knowing each other's other organizations were able to make more of a difference, a self-perceived difference on recovery. I'm going to skip through this for time purposes. So what we are saying now that is that it's not about what you buy, but it's about the bystanders that are going to make the difference. That it's the neighbors helping neighbors that's going to make a real difference. That it's the organizational ties, it's the social network ties that are going to make a difference. And so we want to actually encourage this. We want to encourage the civic participation that leads to that, the social networks that leads to that, the social cohesion that leads to this. And we're moving, as Alonzo mentioned, in the disaster space, from this let's get myself disaster prepared, to the we. How do we get our communities prepared? Okay? So now this is really a sea change in how we see our citizens. We're no longer seeing them as something to be commanded and controlled, but really as an asset. We know that they're going to turn out in disaster. We know they're going to volunteer. How do we start to prepare for that? How do we also take the assets like the organizations that are going to want to be involved and will be integral to recovery and start to leverage them in advance? So we also then should be talking about community capability to collective action. Okay? About the community engagement, about making the community connections, about the community organization towards that effort, about getting businesses back up, getting customers back in, whatever that sector's issue is. So community resilience had been this notion in policy documents back in 2008, 2009. No one really knew what it meant to operationalize it. The CDC was talking about it, National Health Security talked about it. No one knew what can public health do in this space that's really on the ground practical. And that was really the novelty, the innovation of the Los Angeles County Community Disaster Resilience Project. So here's the website. You can still go to see it, laresilience.org. This is really, the brainchild of Alonzo Plow, who is in the back here and was on our plenary today as our leader at the Los Angeles County Los Angeles County Department of Health. But there's also a partnership between the County Department of Public Health and UCLA, RAND Corporation, Loma Linda University, our LA Emergency Services. This was actually a fairly sizable collaborative effort. So we defined community resilience in this project somewhat broadly as the ability of a community to get through and bounce back from adversity through community connections, relationships, and resources. And as I said, this is really, the idea was to just get off the ground on this. The idea was just to pilot this notion of resilience, see what it means, what can public health do about it, and importantly, can we measure the results? You have to have metrics to show that you've gotten anything done. So what can we do as public health, and how can we measure it? Those are the questions. We weren't aiming to get on the moon, we were just aiming to get into orbit on this. We were lucky to have one of our partners, Nita Chandra at RAND, who had developed a wonderful theoretical model on what public health actions lead to resilient communities from a health perspective. So at the top are wellness and access. These are bread and butter public health. We do this all the time. And we know that this is fundamentally important to resilience. And of course, a lot of our conversation today about equity or health equity certainly is smack in this space. Okay? But then what can we do above and beyond that that's operationalizing resilience? Well, the literature review showed a few different areas where we can make a difference, what we called levers that we can use to increase resilience. So we can educate the public. We've been doing this already with some pamphlets and so on, but we can go deeper. There's a lot more they can do. They can learn about how to be responders themselves, CERC programs. They can learn about psychological first aid. They can learn about the basics, such as what are the actual hazards in their community, and also what are the resources and strengths and assets in their community. Community engagement, we will, the community will lead. We will we will work with vulnerable populations, not for vulnerable populations. The vulnerable populations are seated at the table. It is straight off of participatory decision-making, participatory action research kinds of paradigms. Of course, self-sufficiency is important in disaster. It's always going to be. But the difference here is that instead of just focusing on individual self-sufficiency, we're now talking about community self-sufficiency. What, again, are going to be your community is going to need to help each other. Your community is going to need to make decisions about recovering for itself, about how it's going to bounce forward in a way that will be less vulnerable in the future. And then partnerships, fundamental to us all. This gets at the notion that our organizational partnerships between local health departments and NGOs, between local health departments and other agencies in government, and between NGOs themselves are going to create that kind of organizational network that's going to create the social capital, the organizational capital for our communities. So we're going to take these levers and do different activities through using those activities, improving risk communication, improving social connectedness, integrating NGOs in planning, response, and recovery, and other things that I'm going to show you. And if we can do that, we will get to more resilient communities. That was the theory. So keep your eye on those 4 levers. All right. This is a map of Los Angeles County. Here is Pacific Ocean. For those of you who don't know Los Angeles, I invite you to come. But I will tell you, this geography is so big that if you were to put Manhattan, Midtown Manhattan right here, out here would be Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Up here would be Rockland County, Stamford, Connecticut, and out here would be mid-Long Island. So we live in a very large county. So we took 16 communities, and we can talk about how we selected those communities. But what we wanted primarily were the communities to have certain features. They had to all be they all had to have an existing, what was called today, a backbone organization. They had to have some community organization that was active already. It didn't matter what they were active in. We had neighborhood councils, we had communities with neighborhood councils, we had communities with fire safety councils. We had a community that had a gang task force. But they had to have a backbone community organization. We were not going to go in and create organizations. They already had to have activity like that. We wanted communities that were self-identified as neighborhoods. We wanted communities that were reasonable size for us to work in, around 40,000, 50,000. We wanted them to have a mixture of commercial and residential space so that they really had all these elements of a community. And we also then wanted a diversity. We wanted a socioeconomic and cultural diversity, but we also wanted a hazard diversity. So in Los Angeles and Southern California, earthquakes, everyone faces the likelihood, the definite likelihood of the big one coming along. But we still have diversity because down here in the ports, we have exposure to environmental contaminants that are particular to that neighborhood. Up here, this is the mountains. You can't really tell, but they are in the mountains. So they face wildfires and subsequent debris flows. Up here is the high desert. These are towns that face they were facing at the time drought. They are isolated towns in canyons. So any kind of earthquake is going to be even more difficult for them. Heat waves are a particular problem up there. So we have a real diversity of all these things among the 16 communities. And they were randomized to 2 arms. So 16 communities, 8 were put into an enhanced preparedness side, which I'll tell you about, and the other side was the community resilience experimental side. Each community had this backbone organization. The local health department had a nurse practitioner or community educator that was already associated with that town, and that nurse public health nurse was going to be the facilitator and leader with that organization of this project. Okay, they were going to be our conduit. On the standard preparedness or enhanced preparedness side, they were going to work with that community coalition, as we called it, to go through a book that we had on how do you get disaster prepared. Been around for a decade or more. And it really focused on traditional things, kits and plans, being high up on the list there. And it really, most importantly, it focused on the prepare side of the cycle. It really did not address response and recovery at all. The resilience side was going to focus on assessing and addressing community vulnerabilities, developing partnerships, engagement, trainings, and planning, and all of this, all parts of the cycle, prepare, respond, and recover. So how are they going to do that? So the nurse was embedded with the coalition. The nurses were trained in resilience, and they went out to then train the coalition. And they talked about a bunch of things, okay? They talked about what is resilience. We talked about the importance of recruiting from what we called 11 sectors. These were the 11 sectors that we listed at the time. This came out of the CDC FEP grant, FEP capabilities. I will say that these are not the final on what are the sectors in the world, but this is what we were using at the time. But you can see that it included, oh geez, I've got my buttons wrong this whole time. It went as far ranging as media. I think, let's see, somewhere in here is community leadership. I'm not seeing business in this listing. Oh, business at the top, okay. Okay. So they were going to recruit organizations from the 11 sectors to build a broader network of community active organizations. They were going to identify and engage at-risk vulnerable populations. One of the ways we gave them to do this was access to census data as well as access to hazard map data. And they could look at the overlay of the two. And interestingly, we could also give them the ability to look at resources in their community and how are they overlaid with hazards. So that's the asset and hazard mapping part. We taught them about training lay health workers like promotoras in disaster preparedness and response, so that promotoras could then go out into the community and teach citizens. Psychological first aid was taught. We discussed discussed long-term recovery. After each coalition had gone through their trainings, they were then asked to make an action plan of what they were going to do in the following year. What kinds of activities they were going to do to build, on the one side, their preparedness of the community, on the other side of the other arm, the resilience of their community. And they would meet monthly and they would tell us what activities they had done. They had a whole long sheet they had to fill out. Now, talking about resilience is not easy, as you can tell. It's a lot of kind of gobbledygook. And how do you talk about this with lay people, with community? I thought this was one of the better things we did. We said to people, you as a thread can be strong. Okay, you can talk about the strength of yourself as a thread, but it's us as a fabric when we weave ourselves together that make us really strong. That's easy. Now, question is, what kind of fabric are we in our neighborhood? Are we this tightly woven, multicultural fabric, or are we more sort of homogeneous with this rift down the middle? And this would be a kind of conversation that the communities would have about themselves, both to integrate the idea of resilience and how this relationship is important, but also to start to surface issues about who's left out, who's not at the table, who are our at-risk populations that need to be here who aren't here. And there's so much I can tell you about, but I'm trying to keep it down to bare bones here. We did measure outcomes. I promised to tell you about that. Because you can't measure if you've improved the resilience directly. You need a disaster and a comparison group, like did our communities recover faster from the disaster than the other 8? That's not going to happen. what we did is we took proxy measures. So we took that theoretical model of what leads to resilience, and we created measures of the engagement, the organizational partnerships, the self-sufficiency, the education. I would suggest that that kind of model is still the kind of innovative model that you could use. If you have a tightly developed logic model of where your program is going to, you could think about the same approach. So we have these intermediate outcomes. Partnership, we're going to look at, in this, we looked at differences in the coalition level organizational networks, because our direct respondent or receiver of the project was the coalitions, not the communities. We could look at changes in the coalitions, and we did very sophisticated organizational analyses here, pre and post to both groups. We can look at their the coalition's outreach to vulnerable populations, and this we could do by looking at their reports on a monthly basis. We could look at education through looking at tabletop exercises, and we did tabletop exercises, and we published on how to do this, both before and after the project in both arms. One was a pandemic flu, and the other one was a heat wave. And the coalition would be seated at the table and would be asked to respond as the situation evolved. And we would then observe, we had observers look to see how they did on some homemade metrics that lined up against the 4 levers. And self-sufficiency, we were so bold as to say, well, maybe we'll see some effect in the community. And we did have a survey out in the community that we fielded pre and post, looking at all kinds of indicators of resilience. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. So just some stories. The 16 coalitions over approximately a year period did 145 activities. And our data shows they reached 45,000 people in Los Angeles in a year. Now, the preparedness arm, in terms of activities, they both did about the same number, somewhere around 75, 80 activities. The preparedness arm generally did what I would call low-touch events, handing out brochures at fairs. The resilience arm did what I would say is more high-touch events. Okay, they did trainings in communities on psychological first aid. They did train the trainer programs in their communities. They did things like, oh geez, sorry, wrong button once again. Pico Union never had a CERT program in their community ever before. They're a 95% Spanish-speaking community. This was their CERT graduating class. Compton Compton developed organic farm in their community. Acton Agua Dulce tried to put together a network of their ham radio operators because they had ham radio operators there. I don't know why. They have a lot of ham radio operators. They also have a lot of sparsely populated population, elderly, and they were very concerned about them in a disaster. And so the idea was some sort of hub and spoke model. Okay, and La Crescenta, which is this picture actually, built a communications hub, basically, that they were going to use on a daily basis, like they have a digital display, like a ticker tape display that they would use just to advertise, farmers market this week or school event this week, but then also they would use it during evacuations or any other kinds of need for risk communications. So it would be the point is that billboard would be a billboard that everyone's used to looking at for important messages, so that when that message came through, it had some credibility. All right, one slide. At post-survey, the resilience arm, which is the red, had increased the number of organizations in their coalitions compared to the preparedness arm. That difference is 0.06, but we're talking about small numbers here. We actually did not see statistically significant differences between the two arms in our exercise, our tabletop exercise, but the tabletop exercise was incredibly useful. It was a way for the communities to really integrate the idea of identifying their assets and resources, about who was not at the table that needed to be at the table, to really play out our response and to see what they needed to do in the rest of the year. So even if it didn't make a difference, even if we couldn't show a difference here, as an exercise, it was very useful. And then actually, we did find differences in our community survey among the resilience communities. These are significant differences pre-post of having a 7-day supply of medicine, of agreeing with the statement, planning with neighbors helps my household. That's never a question we've asked in this space before. And agreeing that I have talked with neighbors about preparing. Again, going to the point that Lonzo mentioned, that we had billboards out there that saying getting to know your neighbor, or saying hello is the first step in preparedness. You know, they were actually agreeing with that in greater numbers afterwards. This is just the resilience arm. Unfortunately, we lost some funding, so we could not do the comparison in the resilience, in the preparedness group. As I said, we were just trying to get off the ground. We were just trying to pilot this. We were creating the intervention as we were piloting it. So I think in some ways, we saw less of an effect because of that. That's fine. That was not our goal, to show a difference. It was also a very complex intervention. But there are some qualitative lessons worth going into just for a second. It's really important. We found that the best public health people, workers, best nurses, the best study staff were those who were never in the office. Okay? I don't have to say any more about that. They had to be out in the community. We want to be able to engage. We often talk about the grassroots. We end up actually engaging the grass tops. But we want to pull in the grassroots too, and just be cognizant of that. Partners will come into these coalitions and they'll come on and off the bus, as we say. They'll get engaged for a few sessions. They'll give their contribution. They'll step away for 6 or 8 months, and they'll come back at the end, or there'll be someone they can call later on. So there's no insult when they step away. They're still part of it potentially. Public health is a facilitator and it's a connector across sectors. That's one of our roles. And skilled facilitation is really important, especially among our community educators and nurses who are doing this work. I think I just want to stress, celebrate successes. Whatever the community thinks is a success, it may not be what you think of as a success early on, but that doesn't matter. One, you want to celebrate what the community thinks is a success so that it empowers and sustains their effort. Two, and you want to take pictures, because when I'll say as kind of a siloed academic and public health person at the time, I couldn't see the future as well as the communities could, as well as they could feel it. And the fact that they took our resilience effort and turned it, what we were thinking fairly narrowly around disasters, and they took it into the climate change arena, all on their own. And then years later, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is like, hey, did you guys take pictures, or do you have any stories about communities using resilience in climate change? And I'm like, oh, you got a couple pictures. So, follow the community's leads. They are the tip of the spear on this, and it'll serve you well in this very practical way when you capture these unexpected outcomes. All right, before I go, I just want to take any questions about the project itself, because I think it's important to understand what we did, but then I'm just going to give it over to Bridge and Brian with a little intro. So, questions about resilience for the project. Go ahead. Yeah.
I didn't quite understand if they were actually delivering the training content as well as facilitating the action plan, or if they were just facilitating the discussions and application and action planning while others came in to deliver the training.
No, the former. We trained them. We would sit with them and meet with them about each module. that they were going to then go out to at the end of the month and teach. And then, after they've gotten through that syllabus, if you will, we would still meet with them monthly to help them figure out how are they going to facilitate the coalition writing an action plan. What kinds of questions of the coalition can we answer for you? What problems are you having that we can help problem solve? What resources you need outside of your coalition that we can help connect you to? So we were very active as the study staff with the nurses and community health educators. They were a mix, but they were the on-the-ground lead for public health, face for public health in those coalitions.
So it was community, I missed that part, so like health coalition programs where they that were involved in that were involved. See, that's more natural fit there, or is the community doing that? And the nurses in my department, I think they're kind of like, they help us out a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lesson that I can say any more than qualitatively. I think Alonzo would agree. We had a mix. Our health educators were more comfortable in the role of facilitation than our nurses. But with 16 communities, we needed 16 staff, and so we had to grab from both pots.
In terms of where this was born, initiated, something like that, was this something that primarily started like, and I know that it was a coalition, there was all the different sectors involved, did it start with the health department, or did it start with your university, or like how did that happen?
It started with the health department. Now, it started way before I even came on because I heard about it and I was like, Alonzo, I need to work on this. It's really started between, as far as I understand, a conversation between Alonzo and his need to do, and desire to do something novel in the space, and actually a relationship with people at UCLA who were very involved and expert in community participatory methods. And that seemed like what we needed, to marry the traditional emergency preparedness side of public health with the also well-evolved community participatory side of public health, and to really use that as the fuel to find out what we can do in this space. And Alonzo, do you want to add anything more to that? Feel free.
No, that's why I would ask you to raise your hand if you've been doing this with all of my journals. When we started this, everyone defined all of the money coming to the department of youth and funds, and people working on it, and most of the money went into, and someone should know, what the effective management was last year. This was a shift of our CP dollars and from our corruption foundation funding to shift from DT to a broader sense of feeling of the community. So that's right. But it was because the public health department leadership wanted to shift to happen. And Johnson, the overall director, wanted it to happen.
Okay. Oh, one more question. Go ahead.
Like, there's a lot of this that you talk about that is disaster preparedness, mitigation, response, recovery. Do you think the impetus possibly, or because of the disasters that have happened in California, or the wildfires, or the things that people were seeing, was there, obviously the folks that were doing this work already had education around this topic, this like whole community topic of community involvement.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
As far as like from different places in the country.
Yeah.
Florida obviously has had a lot of the hurricanes, so they incorporated a lot of that. But maybe how do we get that into middle America where you don't have those wildfires as much or those hurricanes?
Yeah. Well, you do. You have the floods, right? So tornadoes. I mean, there are very few communities that have low disaster risk, unless you're from Vermont or, I guess what the other low disaster risk is, like North Dakota. By and large, we all face significant hazards of one sort of another, be it flooding, tornadoes, coastal hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires. I mean, I will say that, of course, that disasters are low on people's priorities and communities' priorities, which is why I want to get to the next topic. What's next? So resilience has since become, of course, a buzzword in a lot of areas, and it's now incorporated into a lot of documents. There are a lot of organizations, federal and NGOs, working in the resilience space. This provides us an opportunity, actually, to think about the broader use of this idea in a broader set of circumstances and stressors. So Robert Johnson Foundation has taken the leadership in thinking about this, about how do we integrate what we've learned in resilience and the strength of this idea, which I think is a uniquely strong idea, with issues around equity, issues about health equity, issues around sustainability, issues in the chronic stressors and adversities that our communities face. How can we marry this idea or use this idea around violence reduction, around mental health improvement, okay? And that's really where we're going next. So I'm going to introduce Bridge and Brian in a second. That the idea here is that you're going to go home and you're either going to do, or you're either going to be say to somebody or be asked, okay, you just learned about resilience. Go build a program. You know, or you're going to say to your MPH who just got a job with you, all right, I learned about resilience last week. Go build a resilience program. And they're going to be like, what? And you're going to say, yeah, you know, figure out what it's going to be and how to do it, and you know, focus maybe on violence reduction. That seems to be really important in our community. So what we want to do is take the lessons that we learned in our project, plus the lessons of resilience work that's being done around the country in many areas of the nation, in other topic areas too, and create a website where you all can go and get a start on that in planning a program, where you can get a sense of what are the steps in planning, what are the resources that we can connect you to, who else is doing this work across the nation, and can you connect to them for some resources or tips. So this is supposed to be a website that's useful to you, that allow you to use this resilience idea, certainly in the disaster space, but also we imagine using it in other spaces like violence reduction is come to the bubbled up to the top, mental health is bubbled up to the top, climate change stressors have bubbled up to the top already. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bridge. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. So like David mentioned, we're working to translate the findings from the LICDR into an easy-to-use and ultimately actual website for you all. Normally, a website process starts with content creation, you get into the wireframing and design, and then the actual building and the coding of the development of the site. We've taken a step back here and said, in order to build a site which is truly actionable and truly usable, let's talk to the end users and the experts in the space first. So before we dive into using those sticky notes and getting up and moving about, I just wanted to give you a sense of place where we are in the process and run you through just some of the key insights we've gotten so far from the interviews we've conducted. So again, the major goal here is to make sure that we avoid the common obstacle in websites, that we're speaking about the program, we're speaking about the organization. We want to avoid that and have the purpose to offer distinct user flows. So we were joking about a phrase, we want to be the guide by the side as opposed to the sage on the stage. And to this, we interviewed multiple different groups of stakeholders ranging from academics to experts to professionals to, arguably most importantly, community representatives. And let's just walk through some of the key findings. So we went into the interviews with certain objectives and branding core principles that we knew we wanted to maintain as a website and a project. The interviews helped shape the strategy to ultimately accomplish those objectives. So there's a lot here. Let's focus. Let's focus on the objectives. Really went into it wanting to be the go-to, credible, reliable, and easy to use resource for resilience needs across the country. To do so, we wanted to avoid something that, from a design perspective, we found is pervasive in the space, where there's, as I'm sure you guys are probably even more familiar with than I am, there's a depth of information, and oftentimes it's maybe a nugget is buried multiple layers deep. We want to be sure that there's clear funnels to access what you need to get to, and you can do so quickly. So the format of how we did these interviews was nothing mind-blowing, certainly doable, and recommend in a variety of projects, whether it's web or not, to interview the users first. So we had phone calls with people across the country, ranging from an hour to slightly more. And a great unintended consequence or unintended benefit of this was we gained many proponents and advocates during the process. People were interested in what we were doing and have now become allies and resources for intermittent feedback as we do get into those design and development decisions. Also, as we're launching a website, or as you're thinking about launching a project in this space, the actual launch strategy and pre-launch strategy itself are very important. You want to make sure to build momentum as you're kicking off a project like this. The interviews have been a useful asset for us, as now these folks who are engaged and committed to the program can help socialize and become advocates for us and spread it to their audience. So you'll see we love sticky notes, and I walk around often with Post-its in my back pocket. This is how we gathered, and this is the response to interviews. See some head nodding. You guys might recognize this from human-centered design. This is affinity clustering. And basically, with all of these different groups that come from all different backgrounds, we ask them different questions. But a few consistent topic areas bubble to the surface. So how this works to translate is each one of these little groups of yellow or orange sticky notes is actual quotes or insights we directly heard from the interviews. Then we task ourselves with each little group. So this group all relates to personal stories work better than numbers in the resilience space. To really connect with people, personal stories seem to be more effective than raw data. For each one of these clusters, we create one of these green sticky notes. These green sticky notes are problem statements. These are statements we challenge ourselves with, that throughout the content creation, design, development process, we must make sure that we are answering and solving these problem statements. So this one is, how might we tie back all data and numbers on the site to some type of personal story? And now we know this as we're creating the content. There's going to be times where we need to show results. Let's bring that back to an individual story. And then obviously there's some larger clusters here that we like to consolidate major themes. I'll go through this quickly. So these are the major clusters we saw in English that most people who do not walk around with sticky notes are used to seeing. Just to highlight one, we heard a lot about how can we create a community online where people are interacting, there's feedback, there's Q&A. So what we heard often was there's not a reliable place to go where we can get information that we feel is credible and I can trust. So we extrapolated that and asked some follow-up questions to say, okay, the real issue here that is solvable is that experts are incredibly busy for the reason why they're experts, and they're not usually spending their time answering questions online. So then we reframed what we heard into a problem statement. How might we incentivize these experts to help us answer these questions? Then, again, this is all before a traditional content creation or design or development of a website. We're really trying to get user feedback and get an idea of what's possible. So we create potential solutions for each problem statement. So just to put forward the example of how might we incentivize experts to help answer questions, there's a laundry list here, but we can ask them to have blog mentions where they come on. We can ask the same set of questions to 10 different experts and see how they respond differently and juxtapose those next to each other. But the real guiding principle here for us, and I encourage you all if you embark on projects like this, is to think through how can I create a 10-star out of 5-star experience and then parse back from that rather than saying, how do I build up? For maybe a 10-star experience looks like you have a resilience question, David comes to your house, pop a bottle of champagne, and talk through the issue. Maybe a 7-star experience is you get a resilience professional to FaceTime you one-on-one. So let's think of what that 10-star is and then parse back from there what's possible. So we have this laundry list of solutions, and we'll see how they fit with each other and what's doable with the resources to ultimately create the best solution from there. So I'll pass it on to Brian now, and we'll get your help.
Thanks, Bridget. You probably caught in the one slide that we compensated the interview subject $50. Unfortunately, $50 for each of you, but we'd like to help. We would probably blow the budget out of the water just doing that. But we would like to get your input to help make a more successful tool that Rich and David have outlined. So if you've were nodding your head at the affinity clusters, you probably would nod your head at what is called the rose, thorn, bud exercise. It came from the Scouts, but it's used in the design thinking space a lot. So I'd like you to we're going to do an individual exercise first, and then we're going to gather in some groups and get some ideas around particularly the bud area. But I want to have each of you just take a moment and think about what is going on well in the resilience space right now. What is being covered well currently? And unfortunately, instead of rose, we have orange. Amazon kind of screwed me up and said the orange, blue, and green as opposed to red, blue, and green. So instead of rose, I'd like you to use the orange sticky notes to write down just one idea of what you think is being covered well in the resilience space right now from your perspective. And its detail is important for us as we go through these things. So instead of just writing down like mental health, write down something a little more expansive on that. What are some of the stressors being caused by in the team mental health space? What are some of the things that could be beneficial to the solution of threat? Things like that is what we're looking for, more exposed to just as much for one word bullet. So I'll give you a minute to do that, and then we're going to go to thorns. Just individually right now. We'll do table exercises, and we'll do. If you have any questions, just shout out. We'll walk around and answer them. We're just looking for the things that are going on well right now. One idea for each.
This makes sense to you guys?
Maybe something you heard from earlier today. Maybe something that's new.
A hack
Something
is
validated by some of the
later,
discussions.
for sticky notes not to kind of like curl up on themselves. Instead of peeling it off like this, you can peel it off like side, so then it'll lay flat. Yeah. That's a life-changing. Yeah, excellent. Change your life in 3 seconds.
That'd be brilliant. It'd be very pedestrian. Just want some initial thoughts.
All right.
right, now we're going to go to the easier one, which most people find it easier to identify the challenges. I think you outlined earlier, David, that it's easier for most any sector to say, what's wrong with things today? And I think we want to understand again, what is going on in the resilience space that doesn't get enough coverage, what is not being focused on, or are you finding enough accurate information on? So again, one idea in a detailed format would be great. And that's on the blue sticky notes. Each one of you guys just individually do that.
Does this make sense? Do you guys yeah, it's you can think through. It could be a content that's good, tools that are good, looks accurate, but I think this one's a bit of a way up compared to this. Is this making sense to all you guys? The exercise and the difference between rose and thorn.
All right, this is the area that we actually want to concentrate on the most for the rest of our time we have, which we're about 10 minutes out. We want to understand what some of the opportunities are. What are some of the tools or resources or content type which you personally be very excited to see? And then after we get done with that, that's when we're going to share these sort of green sticky note ideas together as a group. We want each table to do, or if you want to join, if you're a lonesome twosome or something like that, you want to join us on another table, that's fine too. But we want to get a sense of what the collective group feels would be something on the content side. We'd be really excited to see happen with this tool we're going to be building. So again, individually first. Think about that as from your individual standpoint. About a minute. If you were using this site, we'll be cool to see. You want to have interactive map. You want to be able to, like I said, change vectors and data to talk about. I like that. Good detail.
Yeah, definitely the not one word, which is great.
Okay, so if you could, look at your green sticky notes, share some of those thoughts you have with your table mates, and then we just like to have each table sort of report out in about 3 or 4 minutes what you think maybe some of the ideas that you have collectively coming together.
And just to pile on to that, you can really use this time to merge some of those ideas that are coming together, build upon those others. It'd be great to see here additional ideas built that maybe are a synthesis of some of the different things that you came up with individually. Yep. Yeah.
Did we tell you you had an hour and a half? Yeah. Okay, you can go.
So Rose is everything that you think being covered well right now. Things that are going on in a good way with the information that's being covered in the resilience ecosystem. The thorns are the things that are challenges. Maybe things are not being covered so well, being overlooked or underserved or underutilized. And then the green is what are some of the things you would like to see happen? What are some of the opportunities that could be covered in the resilience space? And it's really the green one. As you're doing the discussion around the green ones, we'll come around and collect your orange/rose and your thorns. We'll start to put them on these sheets here so we can have a sense of what the collective group is thinking and we can start to do affinity clusters with this session right here.